eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through for you, for you, for you, for you,
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Deception Detection Radio. I'm Kay.
And I'm Chad.
We pray you all had a blessed week. Tonight is going to prove to be another fascinating evening with our friends and brothers in Christ, author and researcher Gary Wayne, along with author, researcher, and Skywatch TV host Derek-Gilbert. Welcome back, gentlemen. It's always great to have you join us.
Thank you.
Thank you, and really happy to be back and looking forward to working with Derek tonight. I think it's going to be a pretty interesting show.
Oh, you're welcome. It always is. We get you two on together or even separate, and it's exciting. We always learn a lot, don't we? Don't we, Chad?
We sure do.
I just need to learn to talk. Okay, let's go ahead and do the opening prayer, and then we're going to jump in with both feet. Derek, could you please do the honor of the opening, please?
I'd be delighted. Father, we thank you for bringing us together through this electronic medium, and we just pray that you'll guide this conversation, that your Spirit will lead us, even if we don't know where exactly this conversation is going. Father, we just pray even more that you would help us to just turn it to you and just follow where your Spirit leads. Wherever it goes, Father, may it be a blessing to those who hear. We ask that you would grant us clarity of thought and word, so that as we speak, we would add nothing to your word and take nothing away from it. That, Lord, that the gifts with which you've blessed us, we pray, Father, that you'll help us to put them to the best possible use. Again, help us to be clear in our thoughts, clear in our speech, and may this conversation focus on matters that you want, on which you want to shine light, Father. And we ask this in Jesus' holy name. Amen.
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 Thank you, Derek.
No.
Well, you two have had the opportunity to discuss and figure out what the topic is going to be for tonight. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you two and let you kick it off.
Well, Gary, you had some more specific thoughts. I've kind of had my head in one specific topic here over the last few months as I'm working on a new book for the fall. But I think we're going to find that there's some overlap. If you kind of draw a Venn diagram over the topics that we kind of bounce back and forth, that we'll find some areas where they can play off one another. So, but since you kind of had a thought, some specific thoughts on topics, why don't we go ahead with what you had in mind?
Well, I thought we'd talk a little bit about some interesting characters that, most people don't pay a lot of attention to, yet they have seemingly a prophetic and an ancient and a historical relationship that I think people should be a little bit more, I would like to have people a little bit more aware of. And, there's so many things in the Bible that sort of pop up here and there as you're reading through. And if you're not wanting to connect those dots or a little bit curious, then you're just going to sort of not see it. And, you have this interesting little story that's going on in Esther when the Judeans are in exile in Babylon, or in Persia, would be more accurate, later on. And it's a fellow by the name of Haman the Agagite. And he is, the son of a person called Hammedatha. And what's interesting about this individual is Esther calls him, the enemy of the Jews. And the king of Persia promotes Haman the Agagite above all the other princes and kings that would sit at the royal court. And if people aren't sure what I'm talking about with that, and this is King Ahasuerus of the Persian dynasty, is that in that time, conquered kings and royalty would sit at the royal court, but as sort of subservient to the emperor, which would be the Persians at this time. And so this has these implications that go both forward and backwards in history and I think into end-time prophecy once you take a deeper look at it. And as we look back, you see that in the time of King Saul, there's another king, Agag. So you have that title, and an Agagite is thought to be by definition, a descendant of Agag. And King Saul is attacking the Amalekites at that time. And again, just so that people understand, an Agagite is thought to be an Amalekite. And so a descendant of King Agag at the time of King Saul, that King Saul is supposed to completely wipe the Amalekites from the face of the earth from, but does not. And he doesn't even kill King Agag. And so Samuel, the prophet, comes along and actually kills Agag. But somehow there's a descendant that is surviving down through the time that also wants to wipe the Jews from the face of the earth. So you have sort of this blood oath, this blood covenant that is connected through Agag. And David comes along after Saul, and Saul actually loses his kingship, right? Because he doesn't follow, the letter of the instructions from God to wipe the Amalekites from the face of the earth. And David is thought to have done that, except that somehow between the time of Saul and David taking on, there's some sort of surviving royal bloodline that Haman is connected back to, at least according to the Bible. And this revenge that is being taken on with the Amalekites is for what the Amalekites do to Israel when they're a ragtag nation of slaves fleeing Egyptian oppression in the Exodus. And when they're not yet forged in their faith, they're not yet trained in war, they're just trying to survive in the desert, Amalekites come out and try and wipe them from the face of the earth. And when you understand that Amalek is the offspring of a couple of individuals named Eliphaz and Timnah, and that Esau is the parent of Eliphaz, and Esau is the brother of Jacob, who loses the birthright, loses the blessings, and loses the Messianic promise, you have this weird sort of thing, like, is the Amalekites, are they trying to wipe Israel from the face of the earth so that they can inherit the Messianic bloodline and overlay it with theirs? And are they trying to steal and usurp the birthright and the blessings? And we first hear about these interesting Amalekites not when Eliphaz marries Timnah, but in Genesis 14. In the war of what I call the war of 4 kings against 5. Well, what's really odd about that is that this is at the time of Abraham, and so it's a few generations before Amalek's going to be born. So now how do Amalekites show up before Amalek, and what's that got to do with the Messianic blessings and the bloodlines, and does this have anything to do with the giants? And throw that in, and it sounds a little bit as, a drop-in, but I think when we look at this deeper and we understand that the Amalekim are in the area of Seir with the Horim, and the Horim were giants, all of a sudden you have this relationship with giants, and it's the descendants of the Horim that the descendants of Esau marry into and become the dukes of Edom. So I'll just stop there and let you in, Derek, and just make any comments or take it anywhere you want to go from here.
Well, it seems like we're thinking along the same lines there, because this is exactly what I was working on tonight as I'm working on the book, interestingly enough, because I'm working on some interesting connections between the Rephaim, the giants, and and some prophetic implications that I have not heard spoken of before. And just like an hour ago, I was looking at that War of the Nine Kings that you talk about, and looking at the map of the locations of the battles in the War of the Nine Kings. And of course, the kings from the east came in and did battle against the Rephaim in Asheroth Karnaim, which is east of the Sea of Galilee, and that's one of the sites identified later as one of the cities ruled by Og of Bashan, who was the last of the remnant of the Rephaim. Then they did battle against and defeated the Zuzim and the Emim, and we learned from the book of Deuteronomy that the Zuzim were also called the Zamzumim by the Ammonites. The Emim were the Rephaim, the name of the Rephaim for the Moabites. And then you got the Horim, or the Horites, who occupied the territory later occupied by Edom. And as you mentioned, Timnah, the wife of Eliphaz, was one of the Horim, one of the Horites. So scholars think that the reference to the Amalekites in the time of Abraham, because that predates the time of Esau and the founding of Edom, of course, is just a later scribal insertion in the way that we here in Missouri might say that, the Osage Indian tribe occupied the territory around Lake of the Ozarks, for example. And I don't know if that's true. I'm just using that as an example. But of course, back in that time of the Osage Indians, being the main occupants of the state of Missouri, it wasn't called Missouri and it wasn't called Lake of the Ozarks either. It's just for later readers to know where they were talking about. So that may be the explanation for why the Amalekites were mentioned before Amalek was born.
Well, and what's interesting is if it wasn't called Amalek, what were they called? Mm-hmm. And they certainly weren't the Horim, because they're mentioned as separate people.
Separate people. Well, so the area that they occupied was because the kings from the east went from there to do battle against the Amorites near the south end of the Dead Sea, and of course then the kings of the Sodom, Gomorrah, and their allies. So the Amalekites may well have been a tribe of the Amorites. In fact, I was just looking at an article written about 15 years ago by somebody speculating that the Amalekites were actually the people who came into Egypt just after the Israelites left. In other words, the Hyksos kings. I don't think the timing of that works, but I know that was an idea that was put out there, if I'm not mistaken, by Emanuel Velikovsky years ago, that the Hyksos, and David Roll, the Egyptologist, gives this idea some credence, that the Amalekites were heading west as the Israelites were heading east, and the Amalekites filled the power vacuum in Egypt and became the greater Hyksos kings. Personally, I don't think that timeline works out, but I think the bigger point is probably correct, that the Amalekites were just related to the Amorites, who dominated all of the ancient Near Eastern culture in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah, except that when you get into some of the other verses, this is the first amongst nations. This is the nation that lived in the land of Shur from ancient times. So this doesn't seem to be an offshoot.
That's a good point.
And typically, I don't think the Bible makes errors. Maybe translators make some errors, but I don't see any translation errors that would be coming out of it. And I understand the argument of the scribe, and that's used quite readily. But it just seems that the Amalekim or the Amalekites have a more lustrous type of sort of pedigree to them than being an offshoot of a hybrid nation of the Amorites. Mm-hmm. And so that's why it's such a mystery. And there's no secular records left, essentially, of this, except that I would say I think they're more akin to the Horim, because that's who the descendants of Esau marry and name, the offspring of Eliphaz and Timnah as Amalek. And I think they named them after either a giant or a race of people to form the greater Amalekite nation. And the Agagite title is a significant title. Mm-hmm. And it's thought of in the lines of from a historical perspective like a pharaoh or a Caesar. And it's sort of handed from, king to king, as you see with Agag at the time of Saul and the Agagite title with Haman in Persia. But what's also interesting in the book of Numbers is that they're talking about King Agag, who the Messiah who's going to come from Israel is going to have the throne raised higher than Agag, when the Messiah comes and when presumes in the end time from prophecy. So in Numbers, you have this mention of King Agag as well. And so to me, again, that sort of really focuses on there's something to this King Agag and the Amalekites that's more than just sort of a nation that we shouldn't be concerned with. And what's interesting in the Septuagint, in that same verse, and I think it's Numbers 27, hopefully I didn't get that wrong, but it actually translates that, and I'm not a Septuagint fan because it does have a lot of errors in it, but it translates that as Gog as opposed to Agag. And it actually has Gog's, if I understand how it reads, actually has that throne being raised higher than the throne of Jesus. It's just a very, very odd translation in the Septuagint. And so, and again, I don't think it's Og, but the Septuagint writers seem to equate Og with Agag as being synonymous. And I find that a rather odd sort of correlation.
It may just indicate that they considered them equivalent in the sense that they were ancient and perhaps also prophetically future enemies of God's people.
Well, yeah, I think it's got something to do with that sort of prophetically. Did I say Og or did I say Gog on that? If I said Og, I meant Gog. That it's
that's what I thought you meant. Yeah.
So I wasn't sure whether or not I had said the right giant there, or possible giant in that substitution of Septuagint. So just in case people are fact checking us. And so I think this Agagite title raises a significant sort of aspect to it. From why would the writers of the Bible be concerned with that? That the Jesus kingship and title is going to be raised higher than Agag, only because Agag is the first amongst nations. I think it is one of the rival pure bloodlines of Nephilim after the flood, and I think it was one of the nations that was definitely laying in wait. And I think it has something to do with them being very, very similar to the Horim, who the Edomites intermarry with. And I think they're trying to overlay that whole Edomite, Horim, Amalekim, Messianic bloodline to replace it so that Jesus can't come about by wiping Israel from the face of the earth, and then later, Judah from the face of the earth. And I think that's got something to do with that Numbers verse where you have Agag being mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Balaam said, Amalek was the first among the nations, but its end is utter destruction. But that kind of is the point that I was trying to make with relating Amalek to the Amorites, because in my view, the Amorites are far more important, both historically and prophetically, than we've ever considered, and that relates to the research that I'm doing for this book and for the next one. Actually, the Amorites venerated the Rephaim, the spirits of the Rephaim, summoned them in the time of the judges now. So we're moving from Abraham forward about 600 years. Where they were literally summoning them in necromancy rituals. There are rituals that are described by the Amorites who made up the Canaanite kingdom of Ugart. And I think, to be clear, we should be very clear about that. When we say Canaanite, that is just a geographic designator. The Canaanites were actually just Western Amorites, the founders of the Babylonian kingdom. They weren't Babylonian, they were Amorites. Hammurabi the Great was an Amorite. So Babylonians were just Eastern Amorites. The Canaanites were Western Amorites, and the royal house is based on the evidence that we've seen, and there's a lot of evidence we don't have yet. There were powerful kingdoms that have not been, their records have not been found because, for example, there was a powerful kingdom, Amorite kingdom at Aleppo, but Aleppo has been continuously occupied for 5,000 years. You can't dig down and find all this stuff that's buried underneath the city. But based on the evidence we have, the Amorite kings all trace their ancestry back to one particular tribe. So they came out of one royal ancestor, if you will, whose name, Dedan, shows up in the Bible a number of times. Dedan and Sheba, both as nephews of Nimrod, and also as in references in Ezekiel 38 and 39, as tribes occupying Arabia. They apparently, this Dedan, according to an Estonian scholar named Amar Anus, his name, and maybe not his name specifically, but that particular name in the Bible, Dedan, is the source, the origin of the name that the Greeks later applied to their old gods, the Titans. And for some reason, the Amorite kings all trace their ancestry back to that one particular tribe named for this particular ancestor, the Ditanu or the Dedanu, the Titans. Now, were they literally descendant from these Watchers? Because I equate the Titans with the Watchers. Like the Titans, the Watchers, according to Peter, were the angels who sinned and were thrust down to Tartarus, 2 Peter 2:4. Where they are kept in chains until the judgment, just like Kronos and his allies were punished by Zeus and the Olympians by being sent down to Tartarus. So bringing all that back around to the occupants of Canaan at the time of the War of the Nine Kings, the Rephaim, the Zamzumim, the Emim, the Horites, and possibly the Amalekites and Amorites, I think all came out of that same milieu where they were venerating the dead, venerating their ancestral dead, and specifically venerating the spirits of the Rephaim, the men of renown. I think it all fits together, and hopefully I can make that case in a cohesive way when this book comes out later this year.
Well, I think there's a lot of interconnection between some of the branches in terms of how these countries and the kings and the royal families and the things that are going to be set up. And, again, when, looking at that Edomite line that comes and taking that back, I think we can make some connections back into Canaan again, which are very, very interesting. And so you have these names that show up in the time of Solomon, of King Hadad, and you have parallel kingships in Syria that is Ben-Hadad or son of Hadad. Right. And it shows up several times. And what's interesting with that is that this is a Hadad that is mentioned twice, seemingly of a similar sort of title. And Hadad, by the way, is also considered by some to be like a Caesar or a Pharaoh title of kingship that's passed on.
Well, Hadad was the name of the storm god, the West Semitic storm god, who we in the Bible know as Baal.
Yes, that's where I was going to be linking it back to. Absolutely. And,
right, okay.
And so you have these Horim that are in the Dukes of Edom, which two names are Hadad. And then you have these kingships of Hadad. And as you were mentioning in the Canaanite gods and texts and things like, Hadad is Hadu in the Ugaritic text. And Hadad in Akkad. I know that rhymes. That wasn't intentional. And also, this is the storm god that is referred to often as Baal, right? As you mentioned. And so, Hadad means mighty. So when you have that sort of put together, whether or not it's Baal Hadad, then you have and that name is used in Canaanite text, then you have basically, the mighty Lord God as, that name sort of translates. And I don't find that I don't find that as a coincidence. And the son of Baal, and Baal is the son of El, and the son of Baal is Molech, which is, means king. And I wonder whether or not it's sort of connecting a demigod giant sort of beginning to some of these kings and dynasties of the early post-Diluvian period. And when you get into, again, this is not biblical by any stretch of the imagination, is that a lot of people will connect in the occult something called an Amalek as a king in the Mesopotamian area that is the same as the Molech of the god in the Bible, that both have Bible or baby sacrifice to them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And again, Anamelech in those occult circles is who they would refer to as Amalek. But again, that's an outside sort of bringing that in. And they also believe that in the occult circles that Samael and Amalek are connected. And Samael is sort of the Kabbalah version of Satan and or Enki. And so they look at Samael as being sort of the guardian angel of the Edomites. And in other parts into the Zohar, they start talking about that Amalek is basically the god of this world from the physical perspective for Samael. That Samael is just sort of the occult name. And so they're taking, and again, I don't put a whole lot in, I just pointed out as interest that they seem to want to take Amalek back to a particular god or angel that may have been an antediluvian giant, and they also list an antediluvian giant in their Gnostic texts as well. That's called Amalek. And so you get these connections, and you just kind of wonder, is all of this sort of interconnected as you start piecing it together? And it all simmers around giants.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that's the thing that is fascinating. Let me, because I've just been reading a book called The Cult of Molech, a reassessment by George Hyder, which was written probably 30 years ago. But piecing that together with some other research I've been doing here, and essentially it's just trying to collate what actual scholars have been doing and trying to make sense out of the pieces, because I think they get so close to the trees they can't see the forest. That, and just as a disclaimer to people listening, one of the difficulties with these ancient Semitic texts, because they didn't have any vowels, you have to try to interpret from context. When you see the vowels, or the consonants rather, that we interpret as MLK, whether it's Melech meaning king, or Malach meaning messenger angel, or Molech meaning this particular deity, this god, shadowy figure who insisted on child sacrifice, apparently. There is a god that has been attested as far back as about 2500 BC at the ancient Syrian city of Ebla, except that the scholars will transliterate the name as Malik instead of Molech. He does seem to have the chthonic characters, like an underworld type deity, but they don't have any reference, or have not found the evidence yet anyway, for any particular type of human sacrifice. In fact, in the Levant, in the outside of the Bible, they haven't found the physical evidence for child sacrifice devoted to Molech. The only testimony we have is from the Bible itself, which I believe. I accept that this was going on. We do have physical evidence for that type of sacrifice continuing later in the Phoenician areas around the Mediterranean. One of the reasons Sharon and I are excited to go on this expedition to Sardinia later this year, because several of the Tophets that have been found are on Sardinia. Anyway, Moloch goes back to about 2500 BC. But in addition to this Moloch, and there are references to, and he must have been popular because they've like 500 different deities attested at the city of Ebla. And one of the most popular theophoric elements in personal names at Ebla, and that's the God name that was part of almost everybody's personal name in the ancient world, like Micah El or Hezekiah Yah, was Malik. So whatever this God was, and his character is still fuzzy and hazy, he was venerated because a lot of people had Malik in the name. But he also had, it seems, these, minions maybe is a good word, called the Malaku, or in later Semitic, it would be Malachim, these underworld spirits that seemed to accompany Moloch. Now, here's the interesting connection, because when you move forward about 1,200 years to Ugarit, which is that Amorite kingdom on the coast of Syria, maybe 50, 60 miles south of Baal's holy mountain, Mount Zaphon. There are texts from Ugarit that equate Moloch with another deity named Rapayu, and this Rapayu is just the singular form of the word Rephaim. Rapayu was called the god or the king of eternity, whose kingdom was based at the cities of Ashtaroth and Edrei. When we look at Deuteronomy, we see that Ashtaroth and Edrei were the cities that comprised the heart of the kingdom of Og of Bashan, Og who ruled at Ashtaroth and Edrei. Well, it's the same place exactly where this Rapayu, who apparently was to the Rephaim, the spirits of these dead kings of old. The Ugaritic texts depict the Rephaim the same way as they're depicted in Isaiah 14. All who were leaders of the earth, all who were kings of old. So you've got Rapayu and these Rephaim in the Ugaritic text, apparently equated with Moloch or Molech, and these other spirit beings called the Malachim. Now, what to make of that? I haven't parsed this yet because this is research I've just come on in the last couple of days. But
well, there's a lot there, right? And so, and as you mentioned, which is key, is vowels, which is arrives for different sort of transliterations, and you have to be very, very careful, right? Because again, if you take like the vowels out of Agog or Agag and Gog, you have the same letters, right? Mm-hmm. So are they the same? I mean, but I don't think they necessarily are. They may be, similar, but I'm not convinced always that that's the same. Just as, when we're talking, as you said, about, Molech and Melech, and you've got king and you've got angel and you've got this God. And so, but it's interesting as you do that. And let's say if you went, Molech and put I am for ones, as you would with seraphim, the fiery serpent ones, or this would be like the ones of Melech, which would be, and all you're missing is the A on the top. So you can see how people have to be careful as they go down these sort of things in terms of transliterations, but you have to be open to how closely these words are related, and that they tend to have similar sort of meanings going back in time. And then as they transliterate into other ancient languages, they kind of have a similar sort of spelling, right? So you get some connections there. And, and as you're mentioning in the Ugaritic texts about the Rapayu, many feel that is the actual root word for Rapa, for Raphaim.
It absolutely is. Yeah, it absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah, and also they translate that as king as well. And again, so you have those interesting connections. And of course, as you mentioned, Og and one presumes Sihon, his brother, would have been all part of this ancient civilization of that people have come to know from the Ugaritic texts. And the Rephaim is this the whole early post-Diluvian world is just saturated with variations of the Rephaim, because all of these names and more that you were mentioning in earlier on, whether it's the Zamzunim or the Emin and Abim and on, were all considered Rephaim, as Deuteronomy tells us. And also Anakim, which are mentioned in Numbers, are considered Rephaim as well in Deuteronomy.
Right, and they connect back to the Nephilim, which then draws your connection from Nephilim to the Rephaim. Right.
Yeah, because giants is only used at 3 times in the Bible to connect back to the word Nephil or Nephilim. Right, Genesis 6 and Numbers 13 twice. Right, whereas giant everywhere else goes back to Rapha or Rephaim. And then what's interesting as we link that back to the Amalekim is that in the The Amalekites are said to be amongst the Anakim in the Negev areas, as I recall, and there's nothing to separate them from the Anakim. So, are they just people that lived with them, or were they actually an Anakim? And you could interpret that verse either way. But again, I keep getting these connections back on the Amalekim back to the giants, but I'm kind of went down another rabbit trail there. But the point of the matter is that there is this close relationship of bloodlines and Rephaim kingships that just spread out through the whole valley, and the hybrid nations that they create thereafter. And one presumes that the Amorites, who, are Canaanites, but also they seem to be this hybrid nation that marries into the Rephaim in the Canaan area. And they were known as taller than, not giants, but a taller race by the Assyrians, and they were called the Amaru, and I think you used that term earlier as they come out of Mesopotamian records. But they were a vicious, violent, warlike beings that were very militant and were larger than the average person, but not considered giants. So they seem to be more of a hybrid, I think, than anything.
And certainly they took pride in tracing their ancestry back. We've got records from 3 of the ancient Amorite kingdoms. One was the genealogy of Hammurabi, which is not only a genealogy, it's another necromancy ritual, summoning these ancient kings to a ritual meal with one of the descendants of Hammurabi. But when you go back, you see that Dedan, this apparently the founder of this Ditanu tribe, was one of the ancestors of Hammurabi. The Ugaritic funerary text, there's a funerary text that was translated about 40 years ago that similarly summons ancestors and summons the council of the Ditanu as part of this ritual. And then there's a genealogy for the powerful king. He was a contemporary of Hammurabi called Shamshi-Adad, who ruled. A lot of scholars will call it the old Assyrian kingdom, even though they weren't Assyrians, they were Amorites. The kingdom of northern Mesopotamia doesn't really have a ring to it, but from about the time of Abraham, this kingdom that occupied what today would be northern Iraq, traced their ancestry back to 17 kings who lived in tents, and one of them was this king named Dedan, which again is a name that we see pop up in the Bible. It's the same name as that character played by Edward G. Robinson in the Ten Commandments, Dathan, same name. And apparently that, again, is the root from which the Greeks got the name of their old gods, the Titans. Now, the question is, were they hybrid race somehow that descended literally from these fallen angels? I would argue that because of the flood, the answer to that is no. That's my belief. But I'm not going to, without evidence, it's not a hill I'm going to die on. But what we do know from the documents that we found, there is evidence to suggest that for hundreds of years, these Amorite kings were not only venerating their ancestors, but were literally summoning them in necromancy rituals. And for whatever reason, they chose the same name as the old gods who had been condemned by being sent down to Tartarus. Yeah,
and also they believed, and of course all of the dynasties do, it doesn't seem to matter where you go around the world, is that their genealogies go back to the original demigods, the original Nephilim and the fallen angels, and same with in Canaan. So they believe that, particularly the kings of Tyre, believe that their lineage went right back to Baal. And so whether or not that's true or not, that's what they believe. And when you talk about these spirits, there's this site that's over in the Golan Heights that's called Gilga Rephaim from about 3,500 to 3,000 BCE, depending on which archaeologist or historian that you want to look at. And that was virulently known as, the wheel of the Rephaim, because it's kind of a circular sort of thing, or wheel of the spirits, wheel of the ghosts. And I don't find that is coincidental with what you're just talking about in terms of trying to summon these spirits of their former kings or former gods or former demigods, however you want to view them. And in fact, Rephaim can translate a couple of ways, but one of the translations is that it's the spirits of the deceased,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And so one presumes, or when they use that translation, that they're talking about the demon spirits, but they're trying to summon these ancestors back because they're still roaming in spirits, I think.
Right. And there are a couple of things that I'm going to bring to this book in the fall. And so, folks, you're getting a free sample here of some of this. It's not like I'm the first one to discover this. So I'm not trying to put a trademark or copyright or anything on this, because scholars, like I said, who've actually done the work and can read Akkadian and Ugaritic are the ones who deserve the credit here. I'm just trying to piece this together. First, there are several texts from Ugarit in which ritual meals are described, in which the Rephaim are summoned to the sanctuary of El. Now, presumably, based on the research of the scholar Edward Lipinski, the sanctuary of El was located on his Mount of Assembly, which would be Mount Hermon. There are three separate texts, and these are generally referred to as the Rephaim texts, the Ugaritic Rephaim texts, and you can find translations and transliterations of these on the web if you look. All three of them describe the Rephaim as warriors, as mounting their, hitching their chariots, basically, which back in the day was kind of an elite warrior class. The average foot soldier couldn't afford to keep up and maintain a chariot, so that indicates some social status accorded to these Rephaim to begin with. They hitch their chariots, they mount, they travel one day and then another, and at dawn of the third day, they arrive. Now, to this ritual meal being held in their honor. Now, you can think forward, about 1,200 years from there, where there's a night in the upper room where Jesus takes bread, and after he gives thanks, he breaks it and says, "Here, this is my body, which is broken for you. Take this and eat it in remembrance of me." And at the morning of the third day after that, he was returning from the land of the dead. So, it's, in my view, not a coincidence that God, knowing the end from the beginning, allowed these rituals by the pagans for hundreds, if not thousands of years to take place. And then on Calvary, and at the tomb, basically turned that whole thing on its head, turned their rituals on their head. And that's one of the areas I need to do some research on, what happened during the 3 days when Jesus, according to Peter, was preaching to the captives, because I believe he was preaching to those who were being held in chains in darkness.
So do
until the judgment. Yeah. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you got that same period of time and Jesus teaching us a ritual meal to be held in his honor as a mockery, a slap in the face of the spirits who had conned the Amorites for years to summon the dead Rephaim to a ritual meal. And like I said, if it was just one text, I'd be skeptical of it, but there are three separate texts that have been found. And each one mentions travel for one day, then another, and at dawn of the third day they arrive. And in one of the texts, it actually says that El, the creator god of the Canaanites, speaks the words that revivifies, in other words, resurrects the Rephaim. Whoa.
And so do you see that as coming back from the dead, or do you see that coming back from a prison, or do you see that coming back through a portal, or a combination of a couple there?
Well, I believe it's going to happen briefly at the end, and I'll get to that here in just a moment, because I think this relates to what I've been reading about Ezekiel 38 and 39, and the connection between Ezekiel 39 and Revelation 19. But mainly, I think that this was a ritual that the Canaanites, the Amorites, were duped into performing in the belief that the spirits of their dead ancestors would come back and convey power or blessing on the new king. In the fact, in the case of that funerary ritual where the last king of Ugarit, although he didn't know it at the time, was being crowned, the council of the Titans, the council of the Detanu was summoned. Again, I think this was intended to bless and empower the new king, to make him mighty, like the mighty warrior kings of old, the men of renown, sort of like, today in governmental ceremonies or rituals, patriotic events where we, call up the memory of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and, et cetera, et cetera. We don't do it in quite the same way, but there's a reason that you use those images to try to, convey certain ideas to the people. In the case of the ancient Amorites, they were literally performing necromancy rituals to try to summon their spirits of these dead ancestors. And God, I believe, just stood it all on its head and is going to do it again and again. I mean, when you think about this is an article I just wrote for the Skywatch TV magazine. It'll be in the March issue. Think about the hundreds and hundreds of years where the child sacrifices to Moloch were performed. And then later, as the Phoenicians from the city of Tyre moved west and set up colonies at Carthage and in southern Spain and on the islands of Sardinia and Sicily, where scholars have found the Tophets. I mean, you remember during the reforms of King Josiah in the 7th century BC, about 625, I think it was, he defiled the Tophet in the valley of Hinnom, which was where King Manasseh had passed his child through the fire, burned his child to the god Moloch. As the Carthaginians, the Phoenicians went west from Tyre, their god was Baal Hamon. And the scholars I've been reading say, well, Baal Hamon was equated by the ancients, the ancient historians from the time of the apostles, 1st century, as the king of the Titans, Cronus, or Saturn to the Romans. And the great Orientalist Frank Moore Cross, in his book on Israelite religion and Canaanite mythology from, I think, 1973, said there is no doubt that Baal Hamon, the god that accepted the ritual sacrifice of children at Carthage, was to be equated with the chief god of the Canaanites, El. So you've got El on Mount Hermon, equated with the king of the Titans, summoning the Rephaim, the spirits of the dead Nephilim, to a ritual meal where he's going to restore them to life. And it happens at the morning of the 3rd day. And like I said, then you come to the cross, you come to Golgotha, and then you come to the tomb. And at morning of the 3rd day, just think about this. For centuries, these watchers, these vengeful watchers who had to witness the death of their children in the flood of Noah, either they or those spirits, those demonic spirits who are doomed to walk the earth until the judgment, conned the Canaanites and the Phoenicians into sacrificing their children, the way the children of the watchers had been sacrificed for the sin of their angelic fathers. And then when they got a crack at God's only begotten son, and they put him up on the cross and thought that they were finally getting their revenge for the death of their children, and it's exactly what God wanted them to do. For if the powers of the rulers of this age had known, Paul wrote, 1 Corinthians 2, verses 6 through 8, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. He reversed it on them. They thought they were going to get their revenge, and that's exactly what God wanted. And then at dawn of the 3rd day, in a mockery of this ritual that was supposed to revivify, restore, resurrect the Rephaim, Jesus comes back to life. To me, that's just incredible.
Yeah, there's, again, I don't believe that things are written in Scripture, by coincidence. Mm-hmm. They're there for meanings in most cases. So I like those connections. And, when you're talking about the Amorites, so heavily invested in these raising of the spirits, well, they were ruled over by mostly Rephaim kings like, Og and Sihon and... Mm-hmm. And many other names that we don't have, right? I think one of the things that I think is fascinating is that, and scholars obscure this because they keep trying to tell us that the translation of the root word behind Rephaim means healer, like a doctor or physician, even though they admit that there is no incidence outside the Bible where that root is connected to healing of any kind. But when you look at the name of the greatest Amorite king of all time,
Hammurabi, okay, the great lawgiver of Babylon who he was probably a contemporary of Isaac and Jacob. His name, according to scholars, is like most names in the ancient world. It's comprised of two elements. One name that describes some aspect of a god, and then a theophoric element. Well, you break down Hammurabi's name, you've got Hamu, which is like Ami, like Ben Ami, the founder of the Ammonites. Okay, Ami, it means my kinsman, especially my paternal kinsman, like my uncle or my father's. The other part, the theophoric name, is the Rabi, or R-A-B-I or R-A-P-I, depending on who's transliterating it. And they agree. It comes from this same root from which we get the name the Rephaim. But they'll always translate it as meaning my kinsman is a healer. Well, no. I mean, again, there is no text found in Akkadian or Eblaite or Ugaritic where that root means healer. What it means is the Rephaim. My kinsmen are the Rephaim. And there were like 6 different Amorite kings named Hammurabi from the time of Hammurabi in the 18th century BC down to the time of the judges. So it was not an unpopular name. And because that was the theophoric element, it tells us that they were deified. They were venerated.
Interesting. So I was also thinking, as you were talking about the different sort of pantheons as being the same. I think we've talked about this in the past, that I believe that all the different pantheons are the same pantheon around the world. So, and they basically have, the same sort of organizational structure, the same gods, and almost the same story, not in every detail. And you're referring to like Kronos, for example, is part of the parent gods, right? Not part of the Olympus gods, and it's Zeus and Poseidon and gods like that, which are the the Mount Olympus gods, who are the ones that procreate with human females to create titans, right? And Titan can be a heavenly Titan, and it can be the earthborn Titan. So depending on which mythology that somebody's reading, you have to be careful that, you got two different Iapetuses and things like that, and people are going, well, how is that possible? Well, sometimes they're named after the offspring of the god, right? At least in the storyline. And so you have the same thing over in Egypt, whether or not you have the Ogdod gods, which are the creator gods, and then you have like the Osiris kings and things that come thereafter. And there's some other connections in there that sort of kind of go back to this watcher word that you're using that comes out of the book of Enoch. And I think those are the angels that Genesis 6 are talking about. And I'm sure most people think that, but just to be clear. And it's the word that's translated into Greek, the watcher, as the Grigori or the Esgrigori. But what's interesting is that when you get into Egypt, you have the Urshu gods and the Neter gods. And Urshu, it means watcher or intermediary, and the Neter gods are also the ones who watch. And again, I don't think that that's a coincidence. And then moving back into the Draconta aspect of Greek and Drakon, that means to watch. And of course, that comes from dragon. And of course, seraphims were fiery serpent-looking angels. And I think those are the ones that were, at least part of the seraphim had an order called the Watchers that, went to Mount Hermon. So I think we see these terms, crossing over cultures if we can sort of follow the meanings and the stories as being quite similar. So I just thought I'd throw that in just to sort of flesh things out a little bit more. And you're absolutely right. And here's another interesting detail. And this is something I stumbled onto about a year and a half ago while looking for something else. A paper, and I'll bring up the scholar's name again because his research has just been phenomenal. Amar Annus, A-N-N-U-S, wrote a paper back in 1999 titled, "Are There Greek Rephaim?" And he traced the etymology of the word Rephaim, basically traced it forward into the Greek and found that it was used, or it was the source of a term used by the poet Hesiod, who wrote a lot of what we know about Greek cosmology in the 7th century BC. A phrase
was what is the phrase? Meropes anthropoi. And anthropoi just means man, like anthropology, the study of mankind. But meropes, he said, is based on the same Semitic root from which we get Rephaim. And this term was used by not just Hesiod, but also Homer to describe the heroes who lived during the Golden Age, ruled by Kronos. The heroes and the demigods, like Theseus and Bellerophon and so on. In other words, Hesiod and Homer were describing the men who lived when the Titans ruled the earth. He was describing the Nephilim. And when you read Hesiod, you also discover that when those men of the Golden Age passed away, their spirits became the daemons, the demons. Well, okay, that's what Enoch says happened to the Nephilim. So you've got the Rephaim-Nephilim connection there. And you've got the Titan Watcher connection there again, confirmed in the Greek.
And that became hero worship, right?
Yes.
And hero in its ancient name goes back to the offspring of the gods and a human female to produce a demigod. That's what the ancient term and understanding of hero was. And the best, I think, classic example of this as a parallel story of what happened before the flood is in the Atlantean accounts by Plato with Timaeus and Critias. He talks about Poseidon taking Clymene, a human female, and producing 10 Titan kings, 10 earthborn kings. And so that's why I said, so for clarification, in Greek mythology you have Titan gods and you have Titan demigods. And these twins produced 10 kings that ruled the Atlantean Empire. And they were, demigods. They weren't full-fledged gods. And so that's a classic parallel to Genesis 6, where you've got a god and a human female producing a Nephilim-type king, right? And again, as we talked about earlier, Raphael, which is part of Rapha, is also translated as king. These things are not coincidental. They are sort of a universal understanding of what happened in prehistory.
Yeah, the stories and the names changed as time went on, and as the story moved from east to west, as it moved from ground zero, which I believe was around Mount Hermon, to the west. And, the Greeks got the story. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the king of their pantheon, just like the king of the pantheon in Canaan during the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was the storm god. Zeus was the storm god. Thor in the Germanic pantheon was a storm god. It's not a coincidence that they had similar characteristics and occupied a similar place in the pantheon in those different cultures.
And when you understand that, and I wonder again whether or not Amalek takes a name of either a giant or a god of whatever culture and language, because you've got some other giants out there in other accounts around the world, and in particular, let's stay with the Greek one because it kind of intermeshes here to a certain degree. You've got, the descendants of Japheth moving really into the Scythian northwest Turkey area, and these ones are Gog and Magog, who you had referenced earlier. And what a lot of people may not realize is Gog and Magog were names of giants or titans in the Greek mythology. And they're also called giants in ancient English history, along with Albion, Gog, Magog, and there's other names as well that go along with it. So and Gog is actually, associated and means giant in that sort of language of that northwest Turkey Greek area. They overlap. And so you get this connection. So I wonder whether or not the descendants of Japheth, when they married in with these perhaps descendants of giants, whether or not they're recreated or not after the flood, but take on that heritage and that name. And I wonder whether or not that connection has something to do with, the Ezekiel prophecy and the Revelation prophecy. And then when you're talking about, I'll let you come in a second. I just want to finish my thought here because it's kind of interesting, I think, is And it may be that the Ezekiel war isn't the same war that's at the end of the 1,000 years, because you also have in Ezekiel 39 a reference to the second Exodus, which I think is actually an end time event. And so if this happens before the end time comes or during the last 7 years, is that war now connected to Revelation 9 and Joel 1 and 2, where you have this war going on just before Antichrist takes power, and this huge army is swept away in front of them? And this is the time in Revelation 9 of the releasing of Abaddon and Apollyon out of the abyss, and all of these sort of scorpion-like creatures, right? So you've got two different sort of looking creatures, one in the first part of Revelation and this 200 million man army towards the end of Revelation 9. And Abaddon and Apollyon are kind of, they are like the underworld gods of different pantheons, whether or not it's Mot in the Canaanite pantheon, which is the brother of Baal, or it's Apollyon is the sun god and the underworld god, and known as the destroyer in Greek mythology.
The interesting thing is that Apollyon, or Apollo in the Greek, is on the island of Crete. They found texts that equate and identify that god as the Semitic god Resheph. Resheph was also identified with the god Nergal at Babylon, who was the god of the underworld. Resheph at Ugarit was the gatekeeper to the underworld, and Apollo was a god of plague.
Yeah, and so they come along and they create this big war, whether or not it's the same as Gog and Magog. But I wonder whether or not Gog and Magog are part of these things that come out of the abyss, and that's why they're used by name, and they're actually going to be leading the armies.
Well, Magog is a coalition. It was a group of people who I would argue that we're talking more of a cosmic north here, and I think you're tracking this way too. I know there are a lot of scholars who will look at Gog and Magog and assume every time that there's a political dispute with Russia that the Gog-Magog war is ready to break out. I'm going to say I do not believe that the Gog-Magog war has anything whatsoever to do with Russia. I think that is a holdover of Cold War eschatology that we should set aside, because I think it's deceptive. I think it's getting us looking at the wrong target. There's a phrase used in Ezekiel 38 that is used only 38 and 39. It's really only used 3 places in the Bible. One place is here in Ezekiel 38:39 with the Gog-Magog war. And that phrase is normally translated uttermost north, which is the reason a lot of us will look at Russia, because when you draw a line straight north from Jerusalem, you basically cut right through Moscow. And you can't find anything further north than Russia when you're looking at a globe that way. But the Hebrew phrase behind that phrase, the uttermost parts of the north, you find it Ezekiel 38:6, 38:16? I'm going up from memory now. No, incorrect. Anyway, Ezekiel 38:6 and a couple of other places in chapters 38 and 39, the Hebrew phrase is derek-gilbert. That is used only 2 other places in the Bible. One of them is in Psalm 42, where the psalmist is comparing Mount Zion, God's Mount of Assembly, Yahweh's Mount of Assembly, with the Mount of Assembly of the storm god Baal, which is Mount Zaphon. Zaphon was so important in Hebrew culture, by the way, that it became the word for the compass point north. Just as in ancient Sumer, the word for the Amorites, Amuru, was how you designated the compass point west, because the Amorites lived west of ancient Sumer. So derek-gilbert referred to in Psalm 42. The other place is in Isaiah 14, which is that very famous passage, and I'm trying to bring it up here on my handheld Bible, and it's getting wonky because I've got too many tabs open. Isaiah 14 is the famous passage in the King James that says, "How you are fallen, O Lucifer, son of the dawn." I'm using the English Standard Version. "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, Lucifer, son of the dawn. how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. Interestingly, the Rephaim are mentioned earlier in this passage, by the way, in verse 9. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you. The word shades there is Rephaim. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth, just as we described them. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. They're described as now residing in the land of the dead, in Sheol. Anyway, back to verse, let me skip ahead to verse 13. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. This is the 5 I wills. I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. And again, there's that phrase, Yerkat Sephon. There are some English translations that actually render it on the remote slopes of Zephon. In other words, the mount of assembly of this entity in Isaiah 14, the divine rebel from Eden, is Mount Zephon, the holy mountain of Baal. And we know where that's at, by the way. It's Jebel al-Akra. It's a mountain in Turkey. It's on the Mediterranean coast, very near the ancient city of Antioch. It's right on the border with Syria. So about 5,200 feet. It's really imposing. It's a very pretty mountain. Anyway, that is the Mount of Assembly. For the divine rebel from Eden, the holy mountain of the storm god Baal. So we can theorize then that this divine rebel in Eden was Baal, who, by the way, Jesus refers to in the book of Matthew and also in Revelation, identifies as Satan. But that's what is translated. That phrase, that Hebrew phrase, Yerkat Sephon, is what's translated in Ezekiel 38 and 39 as uttermost parts of the north. So I think what we're dealing with here is not a physical location somewhere in Siberia. What we're dealing with is this cosmic north, this mountain, that everyone in the ancient world, especially in the time of Ezekiel, would have known was the holy mountain of the main supernatural enemy of Yahweh, the chief god of their enemies, the Canaanites, the storm god, Baal. Now, the interesting thing about this is that when they rally, and by the way, all the people groups outside of Cush, Put, and see in Ezekiel 38, Persia, Cush, and Put. I did a presentation on Ezekiel 38 and the Gog Magog war last year, and when you look at a map and you see the directions that he's referring to, Ezekiel, writing this in the 6th century BC, was essentially identifying the countries in the other 3 directions of the compass, away from the uttermost points, away from Mount Zephon. Basically, saying people from all over the world are coming to fight against Israel in the Gog-Magog conflict. Persia to the east, Cush to the south, Put to the west. Those are essentially the farthest known nations to most of Ezekiel's readers in the day. So I think that's what he's saying. The whole world is coming together, but they're led by this coalition from Mount Zephon, Gog of Magog. Now, you get to Ezekiel 39, there's something very curious on starting at verse 11. On that day, I will give to Gog a place for burial in Israel, the valley of the travelers, east of the sea. It will block the travelers. For there, Gog and all his multitude will be buried. It will be called the valley of Hamon Gog. Now, this is the thing that's interesting. Travelers is actually not a description of people who are, away from home. These are entities. There's an entrance for these beings in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons, which I'm trying to bring up here. There we go. Travelers. It is a Hebrew word, ovarim. And they travel in the sense that they pass from one side to the other. In other words, from one plane of existence to the other. The valley of the travelers. Now remember, east of the sea, this is east of the Dead Sea. This is the location, Gary, where all of those Rephaim tribes, where they were cleaned out by the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Edomites. And then, of course, the last of the Rephaim, Og, was taken out by Moses and the Israelites. These Ovarim, according to the scholar who wrote this entry in the Dictionary of Deities and Demons, and I'm going to quote here because he'll explain it better than I can. It can be interpreted as the divine name in Ezekiel 39:11 and 14. That's the passage I just read, which may have also been preserved in the geographical name Avarim, which we find in the book of Numbers 21:10 and 11, which is one of the places Israel encamped, a place called Oboth. In Numbers 27, verse 12, where Joshua, or rather, when Yahweh says to Moses, go up into this mountain of Avarim and see the land. In other words, Mount Nebo. The Ovarim is based on a root, Ov, O-B. Of course, in Semitic, the B is a V. Ov means the dead. Ovoth is place of the dead. The mountain of the Avarim, the mountain of the travelers. And there's another place in Numbers 33 where the Israelites are said to have camped at Avarim, which means heaps or ruins of the Avarim, ruins of the travelers. Well, Gary, east of the sea, east in that Jordan River Valley in the country of Jordan today, and this includes Gilgal Rephaim, so I'm glad you mentioned this earlier, are thousands of these megalithic dolmens, burial cairns, essentially, which even in the days of Moses were called the heaps or the ruins of the travelers, located in the valley of the travelers mentioned by Ezekiel. The travelers, these entities who cross from one plane of existence, from the land of the dead to the land of the living.
And dolmen generally translates as portal.
Yes. Yes. And now here's the thing, and here's the link back to the research that I've been doing. In the Ugaritic texts, one of these Rephaim texts, which describes a necromancy session, the king invites the spirits of the dead, the Rephaim, to celebrate a feast. They come over from the land of the dead to the living, traveling by horse-drawn chariots, and they are explicitly referred to in these texts as those who came over, those who traveled, crossed over from one plane of existence to the other. They're referred to in that text as the warriors of Baal. These are the travelers that Ezekiel is talking about in Ezekiel 39.
Yeah, and I think that's why I like to focus on the names that have to do with the Rephaim and or the giants, because they have special meaning. It's just what special meaning do they have? And again, I think just from a timing perspective, I would move that into the last 7 years because it does mention in there that that this is the time after this great horrific slaughter is going to take place that I think is absolutely in equal sort of justice to be done there to defeat these, whether or not they're just descendants of giants, whether or not they're giants, whether or not they've come from another portal, from the abyss, from wherever. I think it's the perfect place to end that when you understand what was going on during the time of Abraham and the time of Israel to take the covenant land back, and that they stayed there to defile that land to sort of try and poke in the eye of God. This is why it's all going to be sort of wrapped up and finished there.
Oh yeah.
And so when you focus on the understanding that this has got something to do with these either ancient gods or ancient giants, that somehow they're going to be part of the end time, just as they're released from the abyss. I think all of those things sort of come together, and it's just sort of perfect in its symmetry.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's startling because I hadn't realized this before. And, credit where it's due. Mike Heiser, in his podcast study on the book of Ezekiel, is the one who got me down this trail of the, what does it mean with the travelers and chasing that thread. And when I pulled on it and learned that it was connected to the Rephaim, it was like, oh, wow, this opens up a whole new understanding of not just the Gog-Magog conflict, but I believe that this ties it to the Battle of Armageddon. Let me just read a couple of passages here real quick. In Ezekiel 39, beginning at verse 17, God describes the aftermath of the Gog-Magog war. And this is God speaking to Ezekiel, speak to the birds of every sort and to all beasts of the field, assemble and come, gather from all around to the sacrificial feast sacrificial feast that I am preparing for you, a great sacrificial feast on the mountains of Israel, and you shall eat flesh and drink blood. You shall eat the flesh of the mighty, the Gibberim, and drink the blood of the princes of the earth, of rams, of lambs, and of he-goats, of bulls, all of them fat beasts of Bashan. Why did he mention Bashan there? Because that was the entrance to the netherworld, in the shadow of Mount Hermon. The last of the Rephaim kings was based in Bashan. Bashan was the home of this king of eternity, this god Raphayu, possibly Molech, one and the same. But when you take that passage from Ezekiel and you put that side by side with Revelation 19, beginning at verse 17, and let me jump to the reference here. Probably would be faster with a paper Bible. Revelation 19, beginning at verse 17. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and with a loud voice he called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, "Come, gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both small and great." And I don't think it's a coincidence. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that those two prophecies are describing the same event.
Well, I think they're similar. I'm not convinced they are the same. And this is as it's described in Joel. A large army that comes that was never of old, nor will be in the ages to come. And we also in Revelation 9 get cited 200 million. And so this has a timing for me that is before Armageddon. And obviously, if one could argue that the Joel War is not part of the Magog War, I get that. But I just think that this is all describing the same war. And we also have the Exodus that is going to happen thereafter, and that's also described in Ezekiel 39 from how I come about this. But one of the things that sort of leans me to separating them is before Antichrist comes to power, this overwhelming army in Daniel is swept away in front of him. And then he invades the promised land and sets up the abomination that crowns him basically king in the temple. I think everybody understands what the abomination is. And one thing I look at in terms of what not only Satan does, but what I also think Antichrist do is everything's a counterfeit. Just as you were describing in Isaiah, where he wants to set up his throne like God. Everything is to be like God, and Antichrist is to be like, the Messiah. It's a replacement guy. It's a counterfeit, and they're going to try and offer, a counterfeit immortality. And I believe that when people see this war, that where they are wiped out in the region of Israel, and then Antichrist moves into the temple, everybody's going to think that is Armageddon. And that's going to be his counterfeit, and he is the coming Savior and the true Messiah. Yeah, agreed. Right? And I think he's going to use that. Whereas when I look at how, maybe I should backpedal. I kind of lost my train of thought on that part of it. But I just look at this as being, if I put it in sequence of events in terms of what happens in Revelation 9 and with Joel and with the timing of the Exodus that happens in the last 3.5 years, and that you have people, when they see this abomination, are going to flee Judea. And this is after this whole army is wiped out, and that's where God's going to protect them for 3.5 years in Revelation 12. I just look at all of that sort of coming together, and I don't want to get this sort of mixed in with the Armageddon War, because I think that's part of how people get fooled.
Well, it's one of those things where I don't want to get doctrinal about it, because it's the way I put it is this: there's a reason he's called Lord of Armies, Lord of Hosts, and because he's the ultimate military commander, and he's not going to tell us so much that the enemy will be able to figure out his plans. The enemy's already going to come up with a deception so insidious that it will deceive even the elect if that were possible. But we're not going to know exactly what God's got planned until it unfolds. And personally, I don't think we're going to be here to see it, thankfully.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, because it's not going to be fun. And I'm glad you mentioned Revelation 9, because I think what this comes down to is this, and this is, I when I gave this presentation in Oklahoma last year, I said, if I really wanted to annoy scholars, I'd have called my talk The Ultimate Zombie Apocalypse, because you think about these armies that are coming from all over the world, led by this this cosmic enemy from what was Baal's holy mountain, or Baal's Mount of Assembly, the Mount of Assembly from Isaiah 14, of the divine rebel from Edom, leading these enemies from all over the world, from north, west, east, south, the whole planet, coming to do war against Israel, and dying in the Valley of the Travelers, and basically dying in this place that the Rephaim had occupied 4,000 years ago, with all of these dolmens. And by the way, there's some really fascinating research on the compass orientation of those dolmens. Many of them are oriented due north and south, which means that as a ritual was performed in front of a dolmen, it was facing the pole star. But the pole star in the days of Abraham was not Polaris, it was Alpha Draconis. But for many of these dolmens, these burial cairns in Jordan, they were oriented like, some weird, like 158 degrees, which is basically southeast. And that orients to where the constellation Orion on the winter solstice is first essentially standing up on the southern horizon. So, and that back in that day represented the constellation of Dumuzi the shepherd, Dumuzi, who was one of the dying and rising gods. Dumuzi, who was the consort of Inanna, Ishtar. And she basically sent him to hell because she didn't want to stay there. So anyway, but the point is that when the church is taken out of the earth, Gary, is it plausible to suggest that when we are no longer here and the Holy Spirit is no longer operating amongst a believing body on the earth, that those who are left may be subject to demonic possession? I mean, could we be looking at literally a demonic army coming against Jerusalem? And that's why Ezekiel's prophecy of this taking place in the Valley of the Travelers, the valley of those who cross over from death to life, is significant.
Certainly possible, because again, later in Revelations, you have these demons coming out of the mouths to lead the kings to Armageddon. So I think, and depending on what somebody's approach is Revelation linear, or is it all collapsed, or is it all out of order? I mean, there's a lot of different approaches. I tend to go with the linear one. So yeah, I think there's just by understanding that certainly for Armageddon that the kings are led to war, I think you can make the case that if it's linear, then what is let out of the abyss is going to lead these kings to the war,
yes,
and which I think is the Joel War and the Magog War. And the thing is in that 200 million man army in Revelation 9, only a third of the earth is destroyed. So it's not a complete destruction, where Revelation 19 is basically the whole world is almost destroyed, and there's this massive wipeout that's going on. So yeah, I think there's that increasing level of catastrophes that go on in the end time. But clearly in prophecy, it tends to happen not how people think it's going to happen. So right, that's when I really liked what you said about not getting too doctrinal on it, and I agree with that 100%. I love to compare notes and speculate, but to think that somebody can come along who's not a prophet and say it's going to happen exactly this way, that's just not the case. All you and I are trying to do are put the pieces together on what it might look like and what we think the order might be.
Yep. The other interesting thing about this is that the things that come out of the pit in Revelation 9 that we know from 2 Peter 2:4, I mean, were the only things that we know for sure. Let me put it that way. The only things that we know for sure that are in the abyss are the angels who sinned, according to 2 Peter 2:4, and those would be the Watchers who descended at Mount Hermon.
Agreed.
Okay, so the Mesopotamian depiction of the Apkallu And again, I come back to this scholar, Amar Anus, who did what Mike Heiser considers the definitive work on linking the Mesopotamian Apkallu to the biblical Watchers. If that is correct, the concept that the Mesopotamians had of the Apkallu, these creatures who came from the Apsu, from Enki in the abyss, to bring the gifts of civilization to mankind, were of three types. There were three types of Apkallu that are depicted in cylinder seals and carvings and things. One is a man with wings, a bearded man with wings. Another is a bird-headed biped with wings. So like a hybrid, kind of like Horus, the Egyptian god Horus. He's got wings, but he's also got the body of a man. And the third kind is the fish-cloaked man that is often misidentified as a god Dagon or a priest of the god Dagon. Those fish-garbed dudes were just one of the three types of Apkallu, or the three types of Watchers, according to what the Mesopotamians believed. But the consistent thread in all three of those is that they are what scholars would call, and I throw these big words out just to annoy scholars that I can use them, theriomorphic, meaning a hybrid human-animal or animal-human. Well, what is it that comes out of the pit in Revelation 9? Something that appears to be a hybrid human-animal. Now, it's not described like any of those Apkallu from ancient Mesopotamia, but how do we know, first of all, that the Mesopotamians got it right? Secondly, how do we know these things can't change their shape? So I think we've got a pretty good evidence that what's coming out of at least some evidence that what's coming out of the pit in Revelation 9 are the Watchers. So we got the parents coming out, finally freed from the abyss. Then you've got their kids, the demons, the spirits of their dead children, the Nephilim, still wandering the planet, comprising what's going to be the great end times army coming against God's holy city.
Yeah, and maybe they bring along with them other things that are locked in the abyss. I don't know whether you're familiar with the descriptions in the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish, but let me just read one of these beings that, and it says, they're described to be large beings, with the head and the torso and the arms of a man and the body of a scorpion.
Yes, the scorpion one, right.
Yeah, and the avian legs, feet, and wings, who launched powerful destructive weaponry depicted as some form of arrows from bows and stinging their prey from a venomous tail. And these are sort of demon hybrid god things that were used to guard the temples and to the gates or the domens to the underworld, right?
Yes,
and they're
yes.
called Scorpion Man and all sorts of things like that. And the technical name that comes out of that is the Akrab Buamelu. That's Akrabuamelu, or Gerdabalu. And noting that Akrab is the Hebrew word, H6137, that means scorpion. And so, again, when we were talking earlier about how those sort of words and names transliterate similarly, just with different suffixes and things, I think, the Akrab Buamelu is very close to the root part of the word of a crab that comes out of Hebrew for scorpion. And not only did they create those interesting beings, but they also created, a hairy hero and a savage dog being and a fierce sort of fish man and a bull man that also carried merciless weapons in the face of battle. Right. And there's a few other things in there as well, but...
the bull man. The name Dedan, the root for the later Greek Titans, but the Detanu mentioned as this Amorite tribe, who, by the way, just wasn't known at Ugarit. The ancient Sumerian kings, the last Sumerian kings of Mesopotamia, knew about this tribe, and they were so freaked out by them that they built a 175-mile long wall to try to keep them out of lower Mesopotamia. The origin of that word, scholars think, is from the Akkadian word for bull or bison.
Yeah. Well, and then you hear about the Minotaur.
Yes.
In Greek mythology. And in occult mythology, they also have a Quinotaur, which seems to be the same type of individual. And, that Minotaur that was slain by, I think, Theseus, as I recall, they had to sacrifice young people to this hybrid being of a bull and I'm trying to think the god, was it Poseidon or Zeus, was one of the two, and a white bull, and you just again wonder whether or not all of these stories have some sort of connection. And as we're talking about these different types of beings, these hybrid beings that possibly were there and possibly might come out of the abyss, it brought me back to something that I was reading in, again, more of polytheist history, but something called, a person called Argiak or Argent, and again, out of the Mesopotamian era. He had a 3D statued museum of beings of various forms in his rule that lived on the earth before. And I can't imagine what some of these beings in this museum would be like, but it had all of these things that were various forms of hybrid beings. And it just came to my mind that there's so many different things that were part of the corruption of the earth before the flood. I just wonder how many other things that we might be inundated with in the end time that will absolutely blow our minds.
Yeah. Well, science is certainly encouraging researchers to start mixing the species. I mean, we know that there are some laboratories, especially in China, where the rules aren't quite as strict as they are here, that have been mixing species and creating chimeras. Yep. But I suspect that there are things going on that we don't even know about that will come to light at some point in the future. Yep. But there's a lot of there when we start digging into the texts that have been found by the ancient world. The thing that astonished me when I started down this road, and you focused more on the occult applications of this research, which is our research is coming at this topic from two separate directions. I've looked mainly at what secular researchers are finding in these ancient texts and just trying to see how they fit together. And I was just astonished at how well it supports the biblical narrative, but you'll never hear a tenured professor at an academic institution, a secular institution, go there with this information. And when you see these things, these rituals that were performed by the ancient Amorites to summon the spirits of the council of the Ditanu, and then you find other scholars who are saying, "Oh yeah, that was the name of the Titans." Wait a minute, they're summoning from the underworld the spirits of the Titans, and you guys didn't think it was relevant to mention it to us here in the church? Well, what the heck?
Offside.
Yeah. So it is phenomenal. And so I really appreciate your research because, again, the dark side is taking this information and twisting it for their own purposes.
They are. And they're trying to bring about the end time, but for different reasons, right? But, we know we have to go through the end time, but we're certainly not looking forward to it. And they're trying to bring it on. So I did a couple of shows on the lost book of King Og, and again, it's got a lot of issues, and I don't want anybody to say take it for canon because it certainly isn't. But as the one that was published that comes out of the Vatican Diaries by that Demon and Father Martin, it's from the Aramaic translation, which I found interesting because it sort of predates it. But typically, it's been part of the Manichaean Book of Giants, which is an amalgamation and built on from their Book of Giants that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so it's an extended sort of version of it that was put together by Manny, who is a polytheist and Gnostic and was absorbing all of the religions around the world. But what's interesting in there, and again, whether or not it's a total hoax or not, and believe me, there's a whole bunch of biblical plagiarism in there, including prophecy, but they actually overlay prophecies in the end time that are identical to what's in Daniel and in Revelations, which to me really points to it not being legitimate, and it was written, later, and those are the added parts on. Went on to the Book of Giants from 200 BC as opposed to 200 AD. Mm-hmm. But where I'm going with it is these end time prophetic prophecies feature Og as coming back as that Antichrist type figure, right? Mm-hmm. And I know there's going to be many antichrists, but again, you have this whole ideology of these giants with the same names of the same region being talked about in clearly a polytheist account, forged or otherwise, that includes Og as opposed to Gog. And then Gog, as it comes up in Ezekiel, if you take that back in the New Testament, it actually can be translated as an Antichrist type figure as well. And clearly this Og is one that is going to be in the book of Og, raised to an Antichrist type figure. But again, we're going to have many Antichrists in the end time. So this could be part of what's coming with all of these Antichrist figures being somehow related to these ancient spirits or demons that are going to either possess or be resurrected or come through portals, however you want to look at that. And again, just as Antichrist is possessed by the one who comes up out of the abyss. So again, I see kind of a connection there, and I know I'm connecting a lot of loose dots there, but trend-wise, it seems we need to be focusing in on that type of understanding to really understand what's going to be taking place in the end time.
No, I agree with you. And just here's a little interesting aside. This is kind of a random fact that I don't know how I'll be able to work this in, but there was a sarcophagus found at one of the Lebanese cities. It's was Canaan or Phoenicia at the time. I'm not sure if it was Sidon or maybe Sidon, but from the Persian period. So we're talking about 6th century BC, maybe 5th century BC. Anyway, the inscription from one of these cities, maybe Byblos or Sidon, of a king there, and the inscription on this sarcophagus reads, "The Og." So now Og, not as a personal name, but as almost a title. "The Og will search for me, the mighty, and in all generations." So this Phoenician king who lived probably, 900 years after Og of Bashan, having inscribed on his sarcophagus, "The Og will search for me, the mighty, and in all generations." Now, I don't have any context in which to place that, but I just thought, interesting. Am I still there? Are we still all together?
Yeah.
I'm here.
Did it go silent?
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, no, I was just had my mic off, so I should have jumped in on the dead airspace.
Okay,
there.
yep. Didn't have anything else to contribute there. It was just thought, okay, here's an interesting little bit of information, but I'm not sure what to make of it.
Well, let me throw something else in there from a prophetic nature, because I found that interesting, is that if we look at Antichrist prophecies, we also understand that it is the spirit of the Antichrist that is always lurking. And I wonder whether or not that type of thing is what is being referred to, because there may be several Antichrist spirits out there. There's only going to be ultimately one Antichrist as it rises to the top, but we're told there's going to be many Antichrists. So if there is spirit or spirits of Antichrists out there looking to possess or be resurrected or get a body, however that happens, then that would link in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, well, again, I think if we piece things together and just filter through biblical lens, we'll get a better understanding of what's coming. And that's why I'm so enthused about this research and about the project. Just trying to, and I had no idea that this had scriptural, or rather prophetic significance when I started down this road. I thought, okay, this is interesting. Obviously the casting out of demons was a major part of Jesus' ministry, so you can make a case that Jesus was doing battle with the Nephilim, in a sense. But when you start looking at the prophecies of Ezekiel 39, and you tie in that whole the concept of the travelers and the fact that they're mentioned and linked specifically to the Rephaim and called warriors of Baal, who just happens to occupy the holy mountain mentioned in Isaiah 14 as the Mount of Assembly of the divine rebel from Edom, and that's the place where Gog and Magog comes. It's like, okay. A whole bunch of pieces all fit together at once.
Yeah, got to be a connection there.
I would agree. And I would even suggest that Mystery Babylon, and I know this goes in a little bit of a different direction, but the prophecies against the king of Tyre in Ezekiel, not just Ezekiel 28, but also Ezekiel 26 and 7, and a lament over the king of Tyre in Ezekiel 27 about how his ships are destroyed and the businessmen and merchants are wailing and so forth, is echoed in Revelation 18. And given that the Phoenicians were just the descendants of the Canaanites, i.e. the Amorites, you've got a hint that Mystery Babylon and the original Babylon, founded by Amorites. Again, that's why I say the Amorites are far more important both historically and prophetically than we've been taught.
Mm-hmm. They are. And they're there. They've been, all of this has been left in the Bible to help us in the end time. Because, I've always sort of said, that, well, not always, but once I got heavily into this research, that I think to fully understand the end time, you need to understand prehistory and history and out of the Bible, because that's really how we need to look at defining things. And so I think that's bang on, that we're going to need to understand verses like, Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 26 and 27 and so many other ones, as we've been talking about tonight, and not in necessarily in the box sort of understanding that people have been teaching us as dogma, but as what it says in the Bible, not what we want it to say. Mm-hmm. And but again, I think we're all going to have surprises as it unfolds if we're still here. But I think we're going to see some of this before we're taken. But that's my own personal view, and not wanting really, to debate that. Just saying, just from my own personal view, I think we're actually going to see some of that. And I also wanted to throw in that when we study this and we're learning about this, is that the other side, the polytheists, mm-hmm. the Gnostics, the servants of Satan, they study this and they have their own history, and they're the ones who are wanting to bring about the end time. So it's important to know that those enlightened, as they like to call themselves, in those secret societies and adepts, they're very, very much familiar with these types of things, and at levels that we're not. Whether it's right. true or not, that's a whole different ballgame. But we need to understand that they understand this. And when we look at sort of bloodlines and things that they look at that coming out of that whole sort of period, is they look at the bloodlines of the Dukes of Edom forming this group called the Eliphs, which, of course, Duke comes from A-L-U-P-H, as I recall the Hebrew. But they more transliterate that into E-L-I-F and E-L-F, and what they call the Elven bloodline of the Shining Ones. And they trace that you have these giants that come out of Tartarus in northwest Turkey after the flood. This is their story, not mine. And that they go both south and they go north. And they form, as they go south, and these are the Scythians as we've come to know them as, they form the Mitanni dynasty. And they're the ones that are the original Dukes of Edom, that these are the same type of people. And these are also the Lords of Anu, as they like to call them, or the tribe of Anu, just using a different god here at the top, which is more Mesopotamian. And right. These are the same as the Tuatha Danann. And so they go south and they go north and they go west as they come out after the flood. That's their belief, and they produce this elven bloodline that they believe is their Magianic bloodline.
Wow. That's really intriguing, because there are some speculation by scholars that the Horites, the Horim, were actually Mitanni, the Hurrians. The
Hurrians, yes. Yeah, a lot of speculation on that, yep.
But also the elite warrior corps of the kingdom of Mitanni, the Hurrians, were chariot warriors, a caste called the Marianu.
The Aryan Marianu, and half of them go down into the Middle East and the other half go to the Indus Valley.
Huh.
That's coming out of their belief systems.
Right.
And that you see part of that history and a legacy in a city that was known as Beth Shean, which was translated as House of Power, but it was also known in history as Scythopolis. Again, taking their Scythian heritage back when they came in and they settled it, and it was named Scythopolis before it was Beth Shean. So all very interesting, and that's that elven bloodline, and that's also known as the fairy bloodline that they like to talk about as well. So
interesting too that the Hurrians were an Indo-European bloodline that intruded into the Middle East, a descendant of Japheth,
yes,
which some speculate was a name that is drawn, or the name of Iapetus, the Titan, is equated with Japheth, the son of Noah.
Yeah, and again, you have Iapetus as a giant, and you have Iapetus as a god. And yes. Also, Iapetus is also in some terms thought of as Poseidon. So it's interesting as you get these sort of meshing of names that come out of Genesis, and I think they accepted the names of other cultures, and that's the names that were written down.
Well, that's
like Gog and Magog or Amalek.
Yeah, just bring it back around to the circle.
Yeah.
Well, Gary, I'm running out of gas here. It's this has been a fascinating 2-hour conversation. A lot of meat in there.
Yeah, there is, and I think hopefully we've raised some curiosity for more people to keep digging on this, because it's just fascinating and it has so many rabbit holes to go down. Mm-hmm. But when you start mixing in all the different things that the Bible has, and especially as what you do and what I like to do a lot is what does it say in Hebrew, and what does it mean as we assemble it? Because if you don't, you miss the meanings, and your description of the words of the travelers and the shades and the people of Ezekiel 37, it just sort of brings it to light that we need to get below the surface on this a little bit.
Absolutely.
I have to tell you, too, that since we've been talking with you gentlemen, when I'm reading the Bible or reading other things, I have gotten to the point where I have to see what it says in Hebrew. And that is coming from seeing you two do that. And it helps me to understand the scriptures and what I'm reading so much more than just taking the interpretation of the person who translated the Bible.
Well, I would recommend it, but I would also, you have to be careful, because, a lot of times, most times, there's more than one meaning to each Hebrew word or each Greek word, and you got to figure out what's appropriate to the narrative. And, is the translation correct? And how should we understand that in terms of those meanings? But, anytime, like when you're talking about giants and spirits and demons and stuff, like, that should be a warning that there's more here that we need to understand.
Yeah,
exactly.
Sharon and I ran into that just this morning again, and our study of the book of Jeremiah. We were getting down to the last couple chapters, and you get into Jeremiah 51, where God says, let me bring up the verse here, so I'm not trying to do it from memory, because right now, like I said, running on fumes. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will stir up the spirit of a destroyer against Babylon. Well, okay, most of us in English, the spirit of a destroyer, he's probably speaking metaphorically. He just means he's going to inspire the kings of the Medes and Persians to come against Babylon.
Yeah.
But
and what's the word?
Well, in the Hebrew, it's ruach, which is the same spirit that God spoke, breathed into Adam to give Adam life. So he's talking about a spirit. He's talking about a supernatural entity that is going to take part in this process. So, you start to see that there are far more events. There are many more events in the Bible that involve the divine counsel and spiritual entities, supernatural entities than we've been taught.
Well, gentlemen, would you please let everyone know where they can order your books and get in contact with you? I'd be very surprised if there's very many listeners that aren't aware, but you never know. There may be a few new ones. Who would like to go first?
Well, you can find my stuff at derek-gilbert.com. That's DEREK P Gilbert, derek-gilbert.com. Or you can, if you're interested in the Bible study Sharon and I do every Sunday, you'll find that at gilberthouse.org, GILBERT, gilberthouse.org.
Don't forget View from the Bunker either.
Well, all of those are linked from derek-gilbert.com. I just figured it's easier to just give one address and or one or two and let them find everything, because everything else is linked from everything else.
And how about you, Gary?
And if somebody wants to find me or get a hold of me and ask me a question, and I do get back to people who do, I spend hours every day doing that. Get a hold of me through my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com, Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com, and there's an ability to connect to an email or to my social media. And you can follow me on Facebook under Gary Wayne and Genesis 6 Conspiracy. I have a couple of pages and in a group called Gary Wayne, the Genesis 6 Conspiracy Group. And I post regularly there. I try and put out a meaningful blog once a week, and it goes very, very deep on these types of things. So if you want to follow me or get a hold of me, get me through Facebook or on Twitter at Gary Wayne63, at Gary Wayne63.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and say the closing prayer. Okay. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for bringing us all together and allowing us to fellowship and hearing your word. We know, Father, that you lead what is said. We put all of our faith in you, Father, to lead us and to guide us and make sure that your word only is what people hear and what is said. We don't want to mislead anyone, Father. We want to do your will. Please look over the people that are listening, Derek and Gary and Chad and myself as we go on in this coming week. Let us see the blessings, Father, that you give us that sometimes we overlook. Let our eyes be open to all that. Please bless everyone and let your word, Father, be etched upon their heart and in their minds. I pray this in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Amen.
Well, again, gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on with us. It's always a learning experience, and it's always a blessed experience. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in. We pray that you have a blessed week. Good night, everyone.
Night.
In the sky, gazing far into the night, I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe